Can the earth remember the names we try to bury in it, the syllables pressed down under soil and root until they learn to breathe through cotton leaves? Can silence carry a heavier weight than iron? Hush like a grape's and quiet like a verdict until a house mistakes its own heartbeat for a knock at the door. And when a man writes pain in the ledger of his bones for too many winters to count, does the ink turn into something that stains back, that rises like ground fog before dawn, that says, the account is due? The wind that moves through the Arkansas rose has a voice. It knows who planted what, it knows what was taken, it knows what will be returned. Pause here, draw a breath with the dark. The story you're entering is a road without lanterns, walked by the living and followed by the dead. If you want to follow real stories that defy time and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our investigations. We continued. Morning on the Arkansas plantation began with a sound that did not belong to music. Timber settling, a rope complaining on a well bucket, the iron mouth of the kettle waking to smoke. On those fields the cotton stood like a pale congregation, rows upon rows of bowed heads waiting for sermon or storm. The seasons were old men there, quarrelsome brothers. Winter came with frost that embroidered the cabin shutters. Spring spoke in flooded ditches that learned the map of the yard. Summer laid its hand on every shoulder and would not lift it, and autumn counted bales like a bookkeeper in a narrow room. The big house had manners even when empty. The stairs creaked in their own rhythm, a grammar of steps learned by years of footsteps, the master's boots bruising the syllables, the mistress's hem softening them, the hurried scurry of children who did not know that a house watches. Keys hung on a nail inside the pantry, 4 of them. The spoon drawer swallowed and gave back small shining moons. The clock in the hall scraped time along its teeth, polishing each minute as if it could be redeemed by shine alone. And outside the smokehouse breathed its meaty, salted breath into the trees, a beast that never left its pen. Elias rose before the rooster because silence was a door he knew how to open. He stood in the grey just before light and listened to the weather turning its pages. The cabin wall still held last winter's nails, a thin shadow of everything that had hung from them, a hat, a coat, a memory. He laced his shoes like a man tying off a wound, checked the bucket, checked the coals, carried the morning out of the cabin as if it might break on the His hands were maps of old roads, work paths and grief paths, that always led to the same places, the field, the gin, the shed, the river bank where the earth went speechless and then answered, carefully, with the sound of water. He remembered a child's laugh that once lived in that cabin and would not live there again. Memory had a chair beside the hearth and did not need to be invited to sit. The air knew the name of the woman whose hands had taught his hands which cuts of cloth made a shroud. It knew the day that name left the place, what was said, what was not. The walls were polite, they never repeated gossip aloud. But the broom remembered where blood had been scrubbed from plank, and the plank remembered the rhythm of that scrubbing, the way a man remembers the rhythm of another man's voice. By midday the fields shone, cruel and angelic at once, cotton all brightness, heat all hammer. The overseer's whistle braided itself through the cicadas. Men and women worked a pace that did not belong to flesh, and the sacks dragged like reluctant animals behind them. A cloud might drift and throw 1 minute of mercy. Then the sun reclaimed its kingdom. The master's horse traced the perimeter like a watch hand, ticking along the split rail fence. Elias kept his eyes inside the work because looking up too long made a man learn the horizon, and the horizon was a letter he was not allowed to read. But at night the plantation changed its face. The iron cooled, the keys slept on their nail like dull stars. The spoon drawer forgot to whisper. In that falling quiet small things spoke plainly, the looseness of a board, the toothy grin of a bent nail, the way a latch remembered the pressure of a palm. Lantern light from the big house stitched a thin yellow line across the yard, and then owls argued theology with mice. Somewhere a fox cut a thought across the henyard and left a punctuation of feathers. The world conspired towards stillness, as if the dark was serving a sentence and wanted to behave. It was in that steady ritual of days, of smoke and salt, of sweat drying to stiffness and washing away in a rickety tub, that the shape of a different ritual began to appear. Not yet a plan, not yet even a decision, only a temperature in the room, a slant in the floorboards, a way sunlight landed where it had no right to fall. Some nights, when others had gone to rest and the fire made a red mouth under the ash, Elias would sit at the table where a stub of pencil and a ragged scrap of paper waited. He could not write, so the marks were not letters, they were tallies. He put them down with the care of a man counting breaths. He did not need names, he knew every one of them by the ache it carried in his body. The plantation pretended to be a universe. It set its own constellations. The gin's wheel a pale moon, the smokehouse the bear, the big house itself the cruel star that never moved. But the river that shouldered the edge of the land remembered a larger map. It moved past title and deed. It spoke another language, one the big house could not read. Elias watched its banks sometimes and thought, water keeps going. Even when it looks still, it keeps going. On Sundays the master put on a voice heavy with scripture and used it like a shovel. He planted words where he pleased. He harvested obedience. He said the world was ordered and smiled when the ordered world looked back from the benches. Measured rows, lowered heads, hands stilled by instruction. After the amen, the benches left rings in the dirt like invisible chains. The wind could not lift those rings. They remained neat and round until foot traffic wore them into the ordinary. And in all of it, silence kept watch. Not fear's silence, not ignorance's silence, rather the silence that ripens, the kind that turns fruit into something sweet enough to survive the knife. I counted by winters, I counted by the ache in my right wrist when the cold climbed into it like a tenant who never paid. I counted by names I did not speak, by shoes that once belonged to men who no longer wore them, by a child who learned to walk and then learned not to need feet any more. I counted by splinters and by the way a laugh can turn into a cough when the door opened. I counted by the master's boot heel and the overseer's cane, by the difference between a bruise you show and a bruise you fold up and keep, private as a prayer. You could put my body on a table and read it like a ledger. Above the knuckle, a thin white line, debt for a dropped pail. On the calf, a long twined scar. Debt for speaking when my speaking was not purchased with a question. In the ear, a ringing that never learned to be quiet. Debt for being near when a thing went wrong and the wrong needed a witness. My back tells its own account. Not all marks are visible. Some write in the marrow, some use sleep as paper. I learned early that silence is a builder. It can lift a wall other men walk past without noticing. It can hide a door even from the hand that reaches for it every day. I kept the quiet the way some keep savings. Small coins in a sewn pocket, the weight of them enough to change a man's walk, but not enough to betray him to a watchful eye. When the house yelled, I did not put my hands over my ears. I let the yelling carve the room until I could see the shape of what it thought it owned. When the fields burned the back of my neck to leather, I learned to hear sweat cooling in a breeze, the way it tells you relief is not a gift, only a different kind of labour. They tried to weigh everything here, pounds of cotton, minutes of daylight, tresses and excuses. The master held a book in his office, calfskin and brass corners, and wrote numbers into it like commandments. He believed a straight column saved a soul. I kept my own book where no one could seize it, in the joints, in the memories that sharpened instead of dulling, in the songs I hummed without letting them turn into song. Every humiliation was a stroke in the margin, every borrowed hour, every stolen word from their speech, another line in the sum. The book grew heavier. Some nights I held out my palms to the fire and felt as if the numbers were written there, felt as if the flames were reading. There is a way a house looks at you when it has watched you carry water through its rooms for years. Shame and boredom in the same stare. There is a way a key sounds when it turns to lock you out. I learned the keys as a man learns constellations. Which star opens a summer gate, which one points winter toward your bed. Sounded them in my head until each note found its place. Pantry, cellar, office, smokehouse. The office key had a bite to it, a small nick that clicked back when the lock said yes. The cellar key loved its own heaviness. The pantry key pretended to be gentle. The smokehouse key laughed at its chain. What I loved I kept in pockets nobody knew. A shell the river threw at me one evening like a small, white email from a world beyond property. A button from a shirt that wore a laughter I could still hear if I rolled the button between finger and thumb. A thread, just a thread that once tied a woman's head wrap, the knot learned like a signature my fingers practiced in the dark. These small matters were not weapons. They were proofs the world had corners the master had never counted. He liked to sit in his chair in late afternoon and count out loud what he believed belonged to him. The chair had a squeal to it. It told on him every time he shifted. He slurred syllables when he had taken his day's drink too early, and then he tried to stitch them back with anger, sober as a whip. If you listened without believing, the man turned thin as paper. He thickened again only when someone else was made smaller in front of him. He loved the mathematics of reducing others. He loved the courage of people who could not answer back, because that was courage he didn't have to respect. I do not know the exact moment the quiet in me stopped being a room and became a road. Maybe the day frost glazed the cotton stubble with the prettiness of church silver, and I saw plainly how beauty will stand beside cruelty without arguing. Maybe the evening a hymn rose from the cabins like a veil, and the master shouted that silence was required, and silence came obedient on the surface, and underneath it the hymn continued in a language he had no ear for. Maybe it was the way a shovel feels at night when you touch it in the shed, cool and patient, a listener. A thing made to move earth does not forget what it was made for. I watched the rows as a man watches a sentence he will one day have to finish. The furrows ran straight like lines waiting for words. The cotton plants kept their secrets, what they had seen, what had fallen between them and stayed. One night a fox passed and folded the plants with its sly body. One morning a blackbird rose, scolding, and then forgave the day. Every day the field recorded, not all books. My ledger grew, it began to whisper in my sleep, not rage, not flame, only the stubborn arithmetic of return. Even patience accrues interest, even silence expects a balance. The plan did not come like thunder. It arrived like a house learns a draft, first a suspicion, then a habit, then a certainty about which door is not flush with its frame. I began with the smallest of domestic devotions, the chores whose faces I had memorized until I could see their skulls beneath the skin. The keys first. I watched them without touching. The nail where they hung bit its own shadow in the pantry wall. Each afternoon when the mistress sent me for spices or sugar, I listened to the keys when they settled after I removed the pantry one. The others chimed soft agreements with one another. I learned how far they swayed, how long they took to fall still. I learned the language of their metal. It is easier to enter a room when you already know how its voices answer. The garden spade next. It leaned in the shed like a good, tired servant. Its handle had the quiet varnish of the hand. Some nights I walked past the shed door and pretended I had forgotten a chore, just to lay a glance on the spade. A tool that moves ground does not hurry. It waits. In Arkansas dark, the cotton rows turned their pale faces to the sky as if to say, there is a ledger above us too. Where do you think the stars keep their accounts? Thread and needle. A mender's instruments, not a killer's. But a mender is also a mapper. Thread knows closures, it knows where a seam runs straight and where it darts, fox-like, around an edge. I kept a length of thread in my pocket to teach my fingers calm when the house practiced cruelty. I would tie and untie small knots until my breath matched their patient logic. If a man can keep a knot from panicking, he can keep his mind from doing the same. Well, its rope made the same cry every morning when the bucket rose. I learned that cry the way some learn a lover's cough. I measured in steps the distance from well to row, row to shed, shed to the dark side of the smokehouse where even the moon is polite and does not pry. I walked those measures with nothing in my hands, then with a pail, then with a sack of chopped wood, then with nothing again, so that my body forgot the difference between work and rehearsal. The office, a room fat with numbers and paper, calfskin ledger sleeping on the desk, a brass latch to the drawer where the master kept his pistol, a little prince whose lineage was fear. The latch had a habit of sticking when the day was humid. He swore, his favourite liturgy, when it did. I cleaned that latch with a cloth and a hum, and once, only once, left the faintest kiss of ash on its tongue so that it would take him one blink more to open it. A blink can be a door can be a night. I paid attention to drink as if it were weather. The master's temper had seasons. I learned the latitude where his words turned to slurs no scripture could save. I learned the hour when his horse grew bold because it could smell a rider who had lost the map of the saddle. I learned the day of the month when the merchant's wagon came and the bottles sang in their straw. I was polite to them. You can be polite to things that mean you harm. You can use their politeness against them later. In the cabins, the elders doled proverb and hush with equal measure. A woman mending in a corner taught me with her silence how to make a plan wear work clothes. Patience is not the absence of teeth, her hands seemed to say as they bit and bit the cloth. Patience is knowing where to place the bite. She never looked at me when she said nothing. She did not need to. Silence carried. Rumour came and went about a man upriver, and another man downstream, and something that happened in a parish we did not name. I did not invite rumour into my plan. It was a noisy guest. I invited soil and rope, wooden handle and moonlight, fatigue and its particular angle upon a human back when the day has spent itself. These things do not gossip, they agree. I began to help the field learn me in the dark. Nights when the moon was shy and the overseer had drunk his own courage asleep, I would slip between the rows and walk their corridors, counting furrows with my feet, teaching my body where to step without conversation, where a root might catch a toe, where a stone insisted on its right to be. I pressed my palm to the ground at the end of the lowest row and felt the earth's cool mouth. I'd yet, I told it, the way a man speaks to a child who wants a story before the first page has been chosen. Shovel practice, not digging. Placement, the sound a blade makes if it kisses soil wrong at night, is a betrayer. It needs to go in slantwise, an angled whisper, not a straight syllable. I learned which parts of the yard kept their own counsel. By the smokehouse's north side, ground wore the smell of salt and meat, and was always a little damp, good for quiet work. Near the pecan tree the soil was gossipy. Roots tattled. I rehearsed slowness. I rehearsed stillness within movement. A man can be a river, looking still, going places. The night-watch dogs understood hunger of a different kind. I did not befriend them, I respected their employment. But the week before the night I would choose, I shared a rhythm with them. Meat scraps slipped at a regular hour, soft words that taught their ears boredom with my shadow. Routine is a leash if you know how to hold it gently. Their eyes told me they would not raise the farm for every whisper, not any more. Inside myself, the ledger flipped to a new page. Not anger's red sheet, no, a clean page, ruled faintly. The title at the top was not vengeance, but correction. A beam in a house sags year by year until someone shins it. Otherwise the roof grows crooked enough to invite rain. When rain comes for years, even pride stinks. I would not live inside that rot, I would not leave it for the next shoulders. The day chose itself. A pale coin of a moon, a drowsy heat even in late season, a bottle clinking its last sermon against the master's teeth. The river, an indifferent judge, made its slow decree from beyond the cotton. A north breeze flattened the lantern smoke. The clock in the hall, I swear, coughed once like an old man and then decided to let the evening. I placed small things where they needed to be without making them look placed. A scrap of rag under the pantry keys so their settling would hush sooner. The office latch newly polished and innocent as a baptized lie. The lantern trimmed a notch low so the house would doubt its own corners. In the shed, the spade facing outward, handle ready, its wooden throat familiar in my palm. In my chest, the quiet that comes when an answer has been earned. I did not think of the act as killing. I thought of it as burial. Work we knew well, work the ground respects. The master had already been digging his place all these years with his deeds. I would only introduce him to the depth he had made. Night walked on the porch with stocking feet. The boards knew better than to talk. The big house breathed its slow, entitled breath, the way a sleeper does who dreams he is a king. Far in the woodline, something larger than a fox tested the air and found it to its liking. The river talked as rivers do, no words, all truth. He called for water. I brought it in a glass whose rim had a hairline crack like a frozen vein. He did not see the crack. The bottle had made a good fog inside him. He drank as if sound itself had gone dry and needed wetting. His eyes, blue coins cold from a pocket, stared past me at some thought only he believed expensive. He gestured. The office, he grunted, paper. He swore at the latch, and I waited one blink and then one more, and then my hand, dutiful as a clock, learned the drawer open for him. He read nothing. He rearranged authority on the desk like it was a card game he'd been born to win. He told the room what it had always heard, that order was a fence and he was the gate, that page and pistol were kin, that names were his to spell. He said a thing about the river I will not repeat. Some words make a smell in the air that takes days to leave. I set down the lantern with its trimmed light. Its flame wore a small, serious face. It made a modest coin of brightness on the brass corner of the ledger, and kept its courtesy to itself. The house leaned closer. The stairs did not creak. Even the clock paused between ticks to listen. He rose. The chair squealed its confession. The leg of the chair kissed a knot in the floor with such a precise pop that it sounded like the snapping of a thread in a hem. He turned toward the door. I stepped back the way the room had taught me to step back 1,000 times, and I let him pass as if I were only air that knew manners. On the porch, the night's breath examined his sweat, judged him loudly for it, and cleared it. We walked toward the roads because he demanded it. Something about boundary or theft or a shadow he swore he'd seen near the gin. He liked to give chase to things that were not running. I carried the lantern at the hip, low, a firefly with a long lesson in obedience. At the yard's edge, I let the lantern's light trip over the shed door just long enough to teach my hand the spade's location in the dark. From the dog yard, no alarm. Only a yawn, like a guard bored with the story he is paid to hear again and again. Into the rows we went. Cotton makes a sound when you move through it at night. It sighs as if relieved to be brushed by a body that is not a blade. The furrows kept their lines like soldiers pressed into right angles. The soil, freshly watered by a small afternoon shower, gave underfoot with a soft that remembered rain. I guided him without guiding him, turning when a turn was in me, straightening when straight was demanded. The river kept its counsel off to our left, a distant, fateful murmur. At the end of the lowest row there is a place where the land dips. It is an old thought there, a folding of earth that has always asked for a name. He did not know the name. I did. I set the lantern down on a clod as if it were a guest needing a chair. The light drew a quiet circle on the cotton leaves, made little moons in the dew. He stepped into that circle as if he had earned it, and opened his mouth to make the night smaller. I lifted the spade. There are acts that do not tolerate speed. The first touch of iron to earth was a lesson no older than the grave. The blade entered with the hush I had rehearsed, an angled whisper, not a clang. He laughed thickly and called me a fool digging at this hour, and I said yes, sir, the way a river says yes to gravity, and cut another slice of ground. The lantern supervised, solemn as a witness who has ironed his shirt. When the first foot of soil was waking, he grew interested. He drew close, shadows folding his face into a theatre that believed itself. He crouched, unsteady, and saw. Only earth, no serpent, no thief, no plot but the one the ground had always told. He scolded me for having no sense, and then commanded me to dig faster, as if I were removing his nuisance rather than revealing it. I obliged. I laid the dirt aside in neat, respectful squares, as though each shovelful carried a... The night leaned in, the cotton shivered without breeze. The dogs turned over and found new dreams. The clock far back in the house forgot to count. When the pit reached that quiet depth where light fails an inch sooner than it should, I halted. He cursed me with an art he liked to imagine Scripture had taught him. He bent to see into the absence I had made. You do not need a rope if a man chooses to lean too far into his own forgetting. You need only the earth's patience and a hand that knows when to help gravity keep its promise. He went forward with the surprise of a drunk, not a child. The ground received him, no sound more than a soft complaint, the kind a quilt makes when a body lies down on it. For a moment he looked up from the dark like a moon at the bottom of a well. He said my name as if it were a word he had rented and now wished to own. "Sir," I said, and put the spade to work. Soil is not cruel, it is thorough. It learns before it returns. Each shovelful of back was a sentence written correct. He argued, sputtered, tried to stand. The uneven bottom taught him that titles have trouble balancing when the earth is honest. The lantern marked time with its small flame. Cotton leaves watched like parishioners who have stayed after the benediction to see whether the preacher lives as he preaches. Somewhere an owl laughed, not at me, not at him, only at the oldness of this story in which the ground never forgets. He begged. Not in the language he'd used for years, not with the confidence of a man who believes heaven has deputized him, but in the raw voice of a creature who realizes that silence, too, has a mouth. I did not answer cruelty with cruelty. I answered measurement with measurement. I arranged the dirt with the calm of a man repairing a fence, post by post, line by line. When the earth reached his throat, he promised a ledger erased, a freedom signed, a sun that would rise different in the morning. The night knew better. Promises made to the earth must be kept by the dead. The last inches were the hardest because the breath of a man is a persuasive thing. It invents arguments, it invents tomorrow, but the ground deals only in returns. I levelled the rose face with my palm until it read smooth to the eye and dull to the hand. I replaced carefully the cotton plants that had watched. I brushed their leaves as a mother fixes the hair of a child who has seen what children should not. I did not spit, I did not pray aloud. I listened to the earth compose its long silence over him, and understood that it was not a victory, it was a correction. The lantern took a breath it could not have taken and then steadied itself. I lifted it, I carried the spade like a gentleman carries a cane after deciding the road is good enough to walk without it. The dogs let me pass. The big house did not wake. The clock remembered its duty and offered a single belated tick, like an old man who has nodded off at the sermon and then swears he heard the whole of it. Back in the cabin, the ash broke under my breath and showed a red heart. I warmed my hands as if I had just come from ordinary cold. Morning did not notice at first. Dawn has a lot to do. Roosters gave their same foolish opinions. The river kept its judge's face. The cotton learned a new stillness in one row and practiced it until the wind persuaded it otherwise. The master's horse at the fence puzzled at a world without a rider. It shook its head as if to rattle the answer loose from air. By mid-morning the yard wore a question like a shawl. The overseer searched the big house with a key voice, louder than necessary, as if keys could be manufactured from shouting. He walked to the office and returned with his mouth drawn into the shape of a command. He called men by numbers, not names. He sent them to the river, to the ditch bank, to the gin. He did not say the word gone. He said, find. Neighbours came in, their harnessed concern, hats in hands, grief measured in the old currency of property. They stood in the parlour where the clock attempted dignity, their condolences marched in sentences that had learned to walk long ago. Women whispered a theology that absolved furniture first, then men. Men inspected doors and the undersides of things that never hid anything but dust. A boy pried at a floorboard with a knife and seemed disappointed by its innocence. Newspapers are hungry dogs, even rumour knows this. A rider took the news to town, a clerk folded it into the day's column like a bone under a coat. The story tried to dress itself in theories. It liked conspiracy's clothes. It tried jealousy on, then theft, then a parable about strangers. The printing press pressed every guess with such confidence that paper creaked with it. But paper is a child compared to soil. Paper's truth is ink, soil's truth is weight. In the quarters we practiced the old craft, speaking without saying. Someone asked whether the pecan tree had slept well. Someone else thought the dogs looked rested. A woman said the wind had a new sound from the north, and another woman said, yes, as if it had learned to respect somebody. An elder took out a hymn and hummed it only in the first sentence. Another elder responded with a second sentence that did not exist, and yet answered perfectly. The conversation grew, invisible as roots. No one stepped near the lowest row without good reason. When they did, they set their feet down with an attention you could have called reverence, if reverence were allowed. The ground there was not different. That was its genius. It spoke plain. It wore a surface that had learned not to confess. But the cotton in that place behaved like an eye that has seen a thing, and refuses to blink too quickly for fear the picture might change. The overseer grew smaller without a master to enlarge him. He shouted from a thinner throat. He took a weight from the rack and found the scale did not help him. He rode the fence line so often he taught the horse boredom. His wife lit lamps earlier than needed. Her curtains blinked as she sent a boy to fetch water he did not need. In the pantry, the keys hung where they always had, but for the first week they seemed newly heavy, as if their teeth remembered a different lock. The legend began where legends do, in the margin between talk and necessity. A child asked, "Who will sit in the big chair?" and the room did not answer for a long time, so the child made an answer out of silence, the ground. Another child laughed and then stopped as if she had put her hand on a stove. A man fixing a hinge told a visitor from downstream that the wind had taken the master walking, and the visitor, satisfied by the lie's politeness, pretended to believe. Lies that aim to protect are only masks for the part of truth that would burn a house down if spoken. By the second Sabbath, a preacher had trouble with his text. He read, "The wages of sin," and the word wages sounded like iron on a shovel. He read the just measure, and the benches creaked uneasy as if sliding toward the lowest row. He closed his book early. He led a hymn no one knew, and everyone knew. The Amen caught on a nail and hung there. In town, the newspaper gave itself to a new explanation each week. The master had fled a debt, he had fled a duel. He had been taken by rivermen. He had surrendered to federal matters. He had left for New Orleans with a widow no one could name. Paper's mouth was tireless. It bit air and called the bite a meal. But the earth does not print corrections. It simply holds. The mistress's face thinned. Grief was not the garment she wanted, but it wore her anyway. She developed a habit, standing on the porch after dark and looking toward the rose with a hand shading her eyes against a night that did not shine. Once, only once, she called the master's name into the dark. The name went out, obedient, and then came back, folded, like a letter returned for want of address. And me, I worked. If anyone noticed that my steps matched a rhythm the rose had taught me, they kept that noticing in their apron pockets. I spoke when spoken to, I answered with the accuracy of a plumb line. I kept the cabin's broom at its post, and the iron kettle against its hook, and the bed neatly made with the severity of a barracks. I tried not to dream. Dreams have a habit of telling the truth to the wrong parts of a man. The field, though, refused to forget. When the wind came low from the north, a sound rose where the lowest row lay, a low, breathy murmur that could have been dirt settling or could have been a word that never found a sentence. The overseer heard it once and swore he heard nothing. The mistress heard it twice and prayed with an earnestness new to her hands. The children played elsewhere. Neighbours stopped riding by at dusk. Even men who loved to investigate with their spurs considered dusk a time for staying near their own chairs. They preferred theories that could be spoken indoors. They preferred villains who could be named, or water that could be blamed. The idea that a field might be a court, and a shovel a judge's pen, made their throats dry. When a letter finally did come, from a cousin who asked after debts, not souls, it was read at the table by the mistress and the overseer, and two men whose neckcloths failed to persuade them they were braver than they were. The letter received a polite answer. The cousin waited and waited for the master's signature, and grew old without it. In the quarters, births and deaths did not halt. A baby arrived the night the wind refused to move. An old woman took her last breath while the lantern ran out and did not complain about the dark. We carried on, because the carrying on was the argument we had against the theologies they liked to preach. That breath belongs to paper. No, breath belongs to God and to the earth, and the earth is not the big house's property. Whispers grew into careful sentences. A man upstream described hoeing a row that hummed under his shovel like a struck bell. A woman downstream said a patch of cotton near a cousin's place had learned to bend as if greeting someone who no longer needed greeting. We did not claim miracles, we claimed memory. A field that remembers is more dangerous than any printed word. It changes hands without permission, and owns the feet that walk it. Years later they will say different things because time likes to put on disguises. Some will say a flood took him and the river wrote its signature over his head. Some will say he rode south and became a man of standing among strangers who do not care where a standing man learned to stand. Some will say a slave did it and never got caught, and they will spit when they say the word slave, the way a man spits to keep from swallowing a truth that would live in him like a second tongue. But the field will not change its story. It tells the same tale every harvest, in a language made of weight and weather. If you stand at the end of the lowest row at dusk in late September, when the sun crawls under the world and drags its red hem across the furrows, you will hear what the field hears, a small, satisfied settling, as of accounts squared. The cotton bows, not to pray, not to weep, only to acknowledge that some debts are older than money. Children who were not yet born in 1827 will play near that row and be called back by mothers who do not give reasons. A dog will refuse to cross there and will circle instead, tail low, ears respectful. A man courting a girl will plan to walk her past the row and then will forget, for reasons he cannot say, and take her to the riverbank where the trees talk nonsense, and therefore do no harm. An old woman will sit with her back to the cabin wall and count, not by winters, not any more, but by quiet. The big quiet after a storm, the little quiet after a baby sleeps, the honest quiet of a field after the last sack is carried in. As for Elias, they will argue whether he stayed or went. They will give him other names, and the names will fit him poorly, then better, then not at all. the way borrowed coats learn a man's shoulders. He will be seen in corners he does not enter. He will be given a grin he did not wear and a scar he did. If asked, he will say he was a man who worked and then went on working, because the world is rude with labor. He will say he once put his ear to the ground and heard the ground whisper back a math he could live with. He will say patience is the closest thing to a weapon that does not turn its edge inward. On a winter night, when frost writes its thin white script on every rail, someone will step out of the big house that is no longer quite so big and breathe a breath that looks like a ghost. The breath will hang uncertain above the steps. If it drifted toward the field, it could learn a new language. If it drifted toward the town, it could learn old lies. It chooses the middle path and becomes nothing, which is the fate of most things that want to be important after their hour has passed. The legend will not end with a moral. It will end with a sound. You will be walking any year, any hour, between two lines of cotton, and you will catch the faintest hush, the courteous kind a spade makes when a careful hand instructs it to enter and leave no mark of its crossing. You will pause and look behind you and see no one. You will look ahead and see the far fence draw itself straighter. You will place your hand on the ground without knowing why. The ground will be cool, composed, and it will not tell your hand a secret. It will simply meet it, palm to palm, agreement to agreement. The ledger is not finished. It was never meant to be. A ledger is a road book, amended at each mile. But a line was drawn here, once, with the steadiness of a surveyor who has waited too long for the weather to cooperate. The line holds. In the big house, dust learns courage on the mantel. In the cabins, babies open their hands and then close them, practicing how to keep a thing that wants to be kept. At the river, a log travelling nowhere in particular knocks against the bank until the bank forgives it. Listen, there are bells somewhere, maybe in a town too far to see, ringing for a wedding or a death, or a day that can't decide. Their metal voices come thin over the fields. The cotton does not bow for bells, it bows for wind and for hands, and on some nights, under a moon that keeps its own counsel, it bows for a silence that has earned the right to speak by choosing not to, for a long time. In Arkansas soil, 1827 is not over. It is an ember, dull, waiting. Watch the rose when the light goes copper and the birds are late to roost. You may notice one furrow lean almost imperceptibly toward another, as if two lines on a page were deciding whether to meet and make a single sentence. They do not. They hold their distance, and the sentence remains incomplete, which is how sentences keep their power. Elias walks somewhere under that sky, maybe far, maybe near, maybe only in the way a name walks after the man has sat down. And the earth-faithful registrar keeps writing, keeps weighing, keeps its counsel, keeps its dead. The story does not finish with a door slamming or a shout. It finishes the way the shovel spoke that night, with a whisper angled into the ground, with cotton leaves lifting their quiet, with footsteps fading into a corridor of rows that look like lines on a page, waiting for a hand to return and write the next due sum.